Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing and reviewing the third Shadow pulp novel from the iconic series, The Shadow Laughs, which was released in the Shadow magazine's third issue in October 1931, and written by series creator and primary writer the legendary Walter B. Gibson. This forms the third in what is called a sort of loose unofficial trilogy that starts the series, and as with any long-running series, there are various elements that aren't quite fully worked out yet, so the first three books in particular of the Shadow stories do feature some notable differences and elements that are not exactly what you expect if you've read other Shadow novels that are much later on in the run of the Shadow magazine. So these three in particular are really notable for having the Shadow at his most completely mysterious and almost mystical in ways in terms of how he appears in and out of the darkness while observing all aspects of crime itself. I think the reason why you can call the first three stories a sort of loose trilogy is that they do have several characters that reappear throughout them. Typically, characters and villains in the pulps would be a one and done in terms of appearing and ending in one story. If they were to escape the Night of Darkness, they would likely be dealt with in another story. But here, these characters, particularly the lead villain of Isaac Crofton, manage to escape and make it to the next book, and then after this third story they don't really appear again, so it's unknown whether they were just part of some of the early elements that were eventually discarded, or if it was intended that they should reappear at some point. That happened with at least two of the villain characters in these first three books, but the others, particularly Crofton, just basically were never reused. The plot revolves around a certain conspiracy that threatens the lives of various individuals. We have a really striking opening of someone trying to pass on information about this plot, but the intended victim is actually gunned down directly in front of them, and they themselves are framed for the crime. And if that wasn't enough, the police inspector who takes charge of the case is himself killed off by an unknown assailant in the city morgue of all places. And that's a fantastic scene that shows that even at this point, Gibson was able to beautifully set up certain elements and then be able to pull the rug out from the reader and to introduce plot twists at the drop of a hat. And that's just the opening chapter to in the first couple pages. It then becomes apparent that another young individual may be targeted. The man's name is Bert Windsor, and he is out at his country estate with several other friends and acquaintances who all are, of course, suspects in this plot. So the Shadow dispatches his chief agent, Harry Vincent, to go out there under a ruse in order to try and figure out who is the actual one behind this murder plot. And as the story progresses, it is revealed to be tied into activities of another gang that's operating in secret, who may have something to do with a counterfeiting operation. And it is very quickly revealed that the reoccurring villain characters from the past two books of Steve Cronin and Isaac Crofton, who was the lead villain in the second novel, they are the ones primarily behind this gang. That's not really a spoiler because it is revealed very, very quickly, and that's why it's really good to read The Shadow Laughs after reading the first two books, because they very much flow into one another, and with the return of these characters and certain places and references back to the first two books, it really helps if you've read those first. We see the return of more of the classic characters in terms of the Shadow's agents return. So we have Burbank, the radio expert and communications man. We have Claude Fellows, who is the primary point man and information broker or gatherer for the Shadow, and of course the lead agent of Harry Vincent, along with the chauffeur Stanley. But we also have the return of the rich playboy persona of Lamont Cranston, who the Shadow used in the previous book, and it is then believed by certain characters that the Shadow is in reality Lamont Cranston. But this book is most famous for the scene that puts that idea to rest immediately, and that is where the real Lamont Cranston returns home and is told of some strange things that are apparently events or things that he said or or did, and yet he has no memory of them and doesn't know what people are talking about. And these are, of course, things that happened in the past book and things in between the two books. He then goes to bed one night in his own home and wakes up to find a strange, shadowy figure standing over his bed who comes into the light and has the very face and voice of Lamont Cranston himself. This is where the shadow confronts Lamont Cranston and says that essentially he finds Cranston's persona, identity, and social standing useful to his war on crime, and so he has merely assumed it. He knows more about Cranston than Cranston knows about himself, and it would be very wise for Cranston to just go off and make no mention of this and just essentially stay gone for as long as the Shadow deems possible. This sets up the conceit that the Shadow merely uses the identity of Lamont Cranston and is not actually Lamont Cranston, that we do not actually know the Shadow's true identity. It was, of course, eventually revealed to be that of World War I aviator Kent Allard, but even that has a little sort of backdoor built into it that Gibson made in order to still have even what is supposed to be the Shadow's true identity revealed many years later in the pulp magazines to potentially be another story or cover identity. But this is where we get the famous scene of the Shadow confronting Lamont Cranston and then looking in, sounding exactly like Lamont Cranston, telling Cranston that he's a better Lamont Cranston than Lamont Cranston is. I know that sounds confusing, but it is such an incredible moment of eerie chilliness, and it's one of the great sort of conceits of the doppelganger figure in literature. It's one of the signature scenes, I think, that people read about or hear of when they start getting into the Shadow stories, and it's really fascinating to see that at this point Gibson was already making sure that he hadn't tied himself down to having his lead hero character have the cliched secret identity that must be protected at all costs. Because had he not done this, we would have had events like what we saw in the second book, and you basically would have had Lamont Cranston with his dual identity as the Shadow. It would have been a very straightforward hero and secret identity of millionaire playboy, and that doesn't leave you a lot of room to maintain mystery about the character when you know their actual secret identity and you spend a lot of time with this character. So it's truly remarkable that in the third book, Gibson decides to do away with all of that before it was ever set in stone, and it keeps our lead hero character shrouded in mystery as the Shadow always should be, because we really don't know who he is. The reader does not know what truly drives the Shadow, or what his real name is, what he looks like, anything. Everything that you know about the Shadow is from the opinions and information gleaned by others. You're seeing the Shadow through the eyes of the other characters and as an omniscient observer in terms of reading the text. Also in this story, the Shadow is still described as being able to almost have sort of mystical abilities of being able to literally blend in with the shadows. He is not gifted with superpowers or anything, or the famous power from the radio series of being able to cloud men's minds, thus making him invisible to their view. But the way the text describes his ability to move in and out of the shadows, it almost sounds like he has some sort of supernatural ability to do so. There's also mention of his abilities to climb up and down walls in order to observe or get in and out of windows, and I think this is just an early version of what would eventually be described as the famous suction cups that the Shadow would use in order to climb buildings and things. So in these early stories, particularly these first three, you'll note that whenever the Shadow is observing criminals or they think they glimpse something in the shadows and it terrifies them, it's basically sort of blurring the line between being realistic and a character without any supernatural abilities and the more sensational aspects of other adaptations of the character that do actually give him mystical abilities. So it's basically Gibson getting to have a little bit of fun with this, but after a certain point, these elements would be refined or dropped entirely, and we would get much more of the classic pulp Shadow that is described as being able to disappear into the darkness. But if you study the sequences, there's always going to be a technical way he could have done that with his expertise in almost all fields of human endeavor, and especially the art of escapism and sleight of hand, or typical things that a magician would employ. So you can get the sense that even there are elements that aren't quite fully formed yet, but it's forgivable because it's still only the third book, and we're still in the early days in 1931 of the character. And at this point, a lot of the things that are seen as cliche now in the realm of superheroes were not even fully defined yet, because the Shadow is the character that would define the great bulk of what it became known as the superhero genre. The pacing of the plot being better than the first two books, I think, helps the readability of the Shadow Laughs. There's more of a charge, more of an energy as you're reading this, even though I would say that, like the first two books, the plot does tend to meander a little bit. The overall impact of the story is good, but it's just not as high stakes as other stories in the series would get. So I think the real improvement here, and what makes it different from the first two books, is that there's a greater sense of urgency in places. The pace is much better. The story moves more quickly. It's a shorter book than the first two, which also I think helps, but you definitely still feel the rough edges that are being worked out. We do have plenty of action interspersed, the really nice plot twists. There are some nice predicaments the Shadow has to escape. He uses multiple disguises. We have usage of the twin 45 automatics against criminals. We have some nice gun battles. We have elements of the criminal underworld. There's a nice trip into Chinatown and a nefarious character who runs an opium den with a secret passage to another building. So if that sort of rings a bell in your pulp-loving heart, then you've got that fun. Of course, as it's a 1931 pulp novel, the proprietor of this establishment is a Chinese character who is essentially written as a sort of stock caricature. It's not the worst example of this, but you read a section of a 1931 pulp novel that has a secret passage in an opium den, and you know that the Chinese characters that are going to be running said opium den are not going to be the most nuanced characterization, shall we say. So that's to be expected, and that's the only element of this book that's obviously a dated aspect of it being a 1931 pulp novel. There's also the introduction of the character Vic Marquette, who is a Secret Service agent who will return on and off throughout the series, and is a really nice, interesting inclusion in the story. As with most characters in Shadow stories, he's introduced and you don't quite know his motivations, and there's an element of mystery in terms of the reader not knowing what his motivations are or what actions he will take. There's also an allusion to the Shadow on radio in this book, as we saw in the previous two books. This is an element that would sometimes crop up in the pulps, and here it's the version that would eventually be sort of worked out, because it actually features the Shadow described as going to make the radio broadcast and being the announcer for the Shadow program, which is how the character was even created. The Shadow was merely the announcer and narrator for the Shadow radio series. It wasn't actually about the Shadow as a character. He was just the narrator for a mystery program. So the early pulps sort of take that conceit and act like that's a real thing in the story world. And so if you were to listen to this mystery program, you would actually hear the Shadow himself as the narrator saying things like "crime will not pay," and it's described as no one knows who he is, and they have a sort of blacked out corridor to a special entrance that the Shadow comes in and leaves at the appropriate time every night in terms of when the radio broadcasts are done. It's a wonderfully atmospheric idea, but also when you think about it, it's kind of completely silly that any radio station or media outlet that would employ a mysterious vigilante to narrate their radio show. Do they actually pay the Shadow? Is this an unpaid gig? I don't know exactly how that would work in terms of the logistics, but it's actually worked into the plot because the Shadow, either by narration or in the actual dialogue of the program, has secret messages passed to Harry Vincent. He has to listen to the broadcast on the radio station at a specific time in order to understand his next orders and instructions while he's away at the country estate. And should he miss the specific messages, he'll be in over his head and get into all sorts of danger, which of course does happen. The story builds to a satisfying climax with some nice action, the usage of an Iron Maiden, which always adds a wonderful element of spice to a pulp story. Harry Vincent in peril, the Shadow having to intervene, and once again coming face to face with the villainous Isaac Crofton from the previous book. So we essentially have the same lead villain in these two books. And finally, most of the threads are brought together. As with the previous two books, though, there are certain plot threads that aren't exactly resolved and certain characters do escape. And as I said, outside of Steve Cronin returning in, I believe, Gangland's Doom, most of these characters don't really get mentioned again or brought up again. So they are some of the only villains who ever actually escaped the Shadow. So that's either an oversight or they were saved to be used in a later novel, and that just never happened. Ultimately, The Shadow Laughs is still a fun and engrossing read today. It's most fascinating as it's an early Shadow story. It's one of the first 3 books that's very foundational for the series, and it has all these rough edges and different elements that would very quickly be refined or dropped or removed entirely in order to bring us closer to the classical image of the Night of Darkness. So these may not necessarily be the best books to read first if you've never read a Shadow Pulp novel, because they are very different in ways. But I think it's also really helpful to be able to see how the series started and then see where it went from there. So looking at these first 3 books as a sort of loose trilogy, it's important to read and know these because this is what the whole series is built on. I did enjoy that it was a shorter, more energetic story in its pacing than the first 2 books, but it also having some plot threads that weren't fully resolved and having a story that sort of meandered a little bit with some elements that have a degree of repetition after the first 2 books. I wouldn't necessarily say it's better or worse than the first 2. I enjoyed the pacing more, but I think it's not quite as strong as a story as elements of the first 2 books, even though those were significantly longer. So it's a sort of a trade-off there. I think it's best to look at the first 3 books as really a whole because they do flow into one another and they share characters, and there are allusions and nods to the first 2 books in the 3rd book. To briefly talk about the original cover artwork, and this is the first time we have the Shadow himself depicted on the cover of his own pulp magazine, and it's not repurposing artwork from a pre-existing pulp source as the first 2 books did. Famously, the first Shadow story had a cover that was repurposed from a much earlier pulp magazine that was completely unrelated, and it featured a Chinese character, so the story was very quickly revised to include a Chinese character to at least sort of match the cover. And then Eyes of the Shadow had a striking cover, but that was another example of pre-existing artwork from another magazine being reused. So here we have 2 figures being confronted by a gunman with the Shadow pointing ominously in the background, but only his shadow pointing is visible. I assume this may be sort of drawing from the opening sequence of the 2 men having a whispered conversation in an apartment being confronted and then shot by an unknown assailant. Or it could be a moment from the climax. I'm not exactly sure. It is a little bit on the generic side, but there's a nice usage of color, nice bit of detail, and even though the background is just sort of plain white, it sets the standard for most of the Shadow covers of having a really bold background that's striking, and even when it's just a plain white background, it draws the eye because it's bold in and of itself. We have the classic Shadow title font across the top. And interestingly, we've also got in the bottom corner here, next to the title, you see this image of a hooded figure. And this is actually one of the original illustrations of the Shadow, I believe originally done for the radio incarnation. So that little image there is a holdover of what the original artist's conception of the Shadow looked like in promotional and advertising material. But the actual figure of the Shadow's shadow is The sort of first glimpse we have, I think, of the classic image of the figure in the slouch hat and the cape, and of course, pointing an ominous finger as if he's intervening on this violence that's about to occur. So, this image has the first true visualization of the Shadow himself on one of the pulp magazine covers. It's got nice drama, it's got really nice detailed artwork, nice color, nice layout. So this really is the first true Shadow artwork for a cover. Now, I read this in the beautiful Sanctum Books reprint. This is volume 49, so they printed the books out of order. They would pair them basically on sort of themes, usually 2 books per volume, but sometimes 3 or 4. These are beautiful replicas, always with the original text, but this is one of the Shadow novels that was never edited in terms of length, so this one has always been in its full length, as far as I know, in the reprint history. So here on the rear we have lovely imagery, and then Sanctum would always reproduce both original covers for the books in the volume. So here we have the original cover for you to be able to look at. So there it is, nicely reproduced and in full color. Sanctum really is the gold standard in terms of pulp reprints, as you get all the original artwork, the full original text of each novel, and reproducing the original dual column style of the pulp magazines, but also resetting the text so it's all nice and uniform. So here we have the opening pages with the really striking artwork showing the opening sequence I described. But this being an early novel, this is really the only illustration you have. Later books would have illustrations scattered throughout, and typically a lot of little small illustrations as well. Sanctum reproduced those in all their other volumes where they actually were, so each book has all of the original artwork, but the earlier ones typically only have a piece of art at the very start. Sanctum always included a lovely extra, so in between the 2 books, you have a lovely essay by Will Murray talking about their thematic similarities and their historical importance in terms of where they fall within the series and unique notable aspects of each book. Then at the end, we have a nice piece on the artwork by Jerome Rosen and showing some of his preliminary artwork, which has been lovingly scanned and included here along with a photograph of the artist. It also talks about how his brother George took over and did really iconic covers for the series. Then we get a really nice discussion of the Shadow's described ability to almost be invisible and how that was handled and discussed at various points, even in the Shadow comics, and also talking about other elements of pulp fiction where invisibility or invisibility cloaks were described. Then there's an entire reproduced bit of writing attributed to the famous John Campbell, who of course wrote Who Goes There, which was famously adapted into The Thing from Another World. But he wrote an entire sort of description of how the Shadow's cloak could scientifically and realistically actually be used to make the Shadow appear invisible, and what materials you would have to build it out of and how you would have to charge it, and he worked out the whole thing with the science of the time. So that's a fascinating read. And then, as always, Sanctum includes this beautiful write-up about the man himself, the legendary Walter B. Gibson, the creator and primary writer of the Shadow. So these are really fantastic volumes. These are the best way to read the Shadow pulp novels. They are unfortunately out of print, as several years ago Sanctum lost the license, and so they were unable to complete reprinting the whole series. They only had a couple more of the Bruce Elliott stories to reprint, and then they would have reprinted the entirety of the Shadow pulp series. So if you're able to collect all of the 153 volumes, I think it's 151 plus 2 annuals. That is the whole run of the Sanctum series, and they're unfortunately going for increasingly high values on the used market. So basically, if you find any of these at a decent price, just snap them up, because they are really the gold standard for reprinting pulp magazine stories, and they are the best way to read the adventures of the Shadow. So those are my thoughts on reading The Shadow Laughs, the third in the classic Shadow series, and the sort of closing of the opening 1931 trilogy of stories by Walter B. Gibson that gets the ball rolling in terms of the character and the world of the Shadow. It's essential to read as a fan of the character, to go back to this early point. It's like going back to the early years and golden age comics of any classic comic superhero character and finding just how different those could be compared to the sort of tried and true version that you know. It does show growth over the first two books and sets up elements that would be picked up and continued in later books in the series. You can see the series already starting to move. But of course, the most important aspect of The Shadow Laughs is the famous scene where the Shadow confronts Lamont Cranston and the reader finds out that the Shadow is indeed not actually Lamont Cranston, but the Knight of Darkness merely uses the Cranston persona whenever he feels like it as part of his never-ending war on crime. As always, I hope my babblings about the world of the Shadow and the pulp magazines have been at least somewhat fun and informative. These stories truly are part of American pop culture and deserve to be better known. If you're at all interested in The Shadow, I cannot recommend the Sanctum editions enough. The only problem, as I said, is that they are out of print and they have very much become collector's items, and so trying to track down a complete set or just various volumes of their Shadow, Doc Savage, and other reprints can be quite pricey, but if you're patient, you can typically find a couple volumes here and there, and I think they're really unmatched in terms of pulp reprints, and especially for The Shadow, because your only other option is tracking down the vintage paperbacks from the 60s and 70s, which sometimes could have the stories in an edited form in terms of edited for length, and those themselves are collectible due to the fantastic artwork and wonderful nature of those paperbacks. And outside of that, you're stuck with some various other unofficial reprints and trying to find fan versions from over the years, or trying to collect the original pulp editions themselves, which are, of course, very expensive and hard to come by. Please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely Shadow editions on the shelves. Keep reading classic pulp adventures, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching. And as always, and as the concluding line of The Shadow Laugh says, the Shadow knows.